Well, I'm here once again, and much to my great pleasure, with Massimo Pigliucci.
That's because you're a
Uh,
sucker for punishment.
that's right. Although Massimo, this is a special episode because I gather that we are inaugurating a new channel for blogging heads, which is going to be called Meaning of Life TV.
That's right.
Yeah, and I guess it's a revival of a site that Robert Wright used to have, upon which such luminaries as Daniel Dennett once appeared. And so
Hey,
you and I are the next generation. It's like Star Trek. We're the next generation of Meaning of Life TV.
we have something to look up for,
So today, Massimo, we thought we would talk a little bit about ethics, in light of the new channel.
right?
Oh, I forgot to do introductions. So, Massimo, what?
Yeah, who
I
are
got
we
so
anyway?
excited. I got so excited. I forgot to do introductions. Massimo, why don't you introduce yourself and then I'll do the same.
Okay, I'm Massimo Pigliucci. I am a professor of philosophy at the City College of New York.
And I'm Dan Kaufman. I am a professor of philosophy at Missouri State University. So we decided that we were going to talk about morals today, about ethics, because in part because it's an issue that's come up a lot on your Scientia Salon webzine, despite the fact that it's a webzine devoted to the intersection of science and philosophy. The
Right,
question of morality comes up a lot. And also, we thought it would be make sense given the new focus of the new channel for blogging heads.
right,
Specifically, we were going to talk about the subject of moral realism and the various problems and questions that surround it. And so I think in this, with respect to this, it's probably a good idea to start maybe with some substantial definition and disambiguation,
right,
because there's a lot of different positions on this map
right.
that we should clarify. So, how would you characterize moral realism, anti-realism, as opposed to, let's say, moral objectivism or moral subjectivism or moral relativism? How do you see the various positions on the position map?
Right. I mean, this is a complex territory, and of course, feel free to jump in fact, and sort of correct me whenever you feel that I'm going in the wrong direction. But at a very basic level, I think first of all we need to make a distinction, which you just implicitly made, between realism or anti-realism and objectivism or non-objectivism, because too many people seem to think that one can have objective notions only about things that are ontologically real in a substantive sense.
Right.
And that's not true. I can, for instance, you don't need to be a realist about mathematics. You don't need to be thinking of mathematical objects as, in a Platonic sense, to make very objective claims about mathematical structures. So the idea that the two positions that there's no way to be objective in ethics, let's say in this particular case, unless you're a realist, I think is entirely misguided, and so we should sort of keep the two things separate. Um, in terms of realism versus anti-realism, and then of course there is another very weird position lately that's referred to as quasi-realism. I'm talking about Simon Blackburn, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe we can get there later. I actually have a fuzzy understanding of what that even means. But realism, in terms of just realism and anti-realism, I suppose the basic idea is just like in other fields, there's realism and anti-realism in the philosophy of science. There is realism and anti-realism, as I just mentioned, in the philosophy of mathematics. But essentially, a realist makes some kind of strong ontological claim, saying that in the case of ethics, there is such a thing as moral facts and moral truth that are, in a sense, mind independent. That is, that we should all agree on, not just because these are objective truths of some sort, but also because they are, in a sense, out there. And of course, this sense of out there needs to be cashed in. It's not that one can point a telescope and discover a moral truth. But that, I think, is the basic idea. Just like, again, in mathematics, where mathematical realists say that mathematical structures are real in a mind-independent sense, although they don't say, and here's a telescope and there's the number 4. Kind of thing. An anti-realist, of course, is somebody who denies that. Is somebody who says, no, there is no ontologically substantive entity or truth out there to be found about ethics or mathematics or whatever. And that doesn't mean, of course, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that you're then, as an anti-realist, committed to some kind of relativism or skepticism or agnosticism about ethics or mathematics. It just means that you don't think that there is any such a thing as an objective, as a moral truth out there, as you say. So you think that that's a basic understanding of things? What would you add?
I don't know that I would add. It's really actually, now that I'm thinking about it, as I was listening to you talk, my stomach sank a little bit as I started realizing how hard it is. Because look, I think that the way that you describe realism with respect to in other areas is easier kind of to see, right? So I understand what we mean by metaphysical realism, let's say with regard to physical objects, right? So it's
Right.
the view that the chair exists independently of anyone's perception of it, right? So that,
Correct.
what Hume called continued and distinct existence, right? So that when
Yeah.
I walk out of the room, the chair is still there, it exists separate from my perception, and so on and so forth. Then we can have a million and one fights about what the mind independent object really is like, but that's not relevant to this discussion.
Correct.
And I also see how, with regard to physical objects, realism of physical objects, we can easily describe the realist position in terms of truth, right? Because the idea being something like, well, look, when I say the chair is in the room, I mean that I consider that conceive of that as being true in a very straightforward way. It's true in the sense that the chair really exists and it really has this characteristic.
Right.
But with moral realism, it seems to me harder to harder to tell that story in quite that way, right? Because when we're talking about moral realism, so let's be specific, we're talking about the existence of moral obligations and duties, right?
Yes.
And so, first of all, it's not entirely clear what the relevant commensurate sense of mind independence is, as it would be in the case of a physical object. So what do I mean when I say a moral duty exists independently? And also, it wouldn't be independently of perception. Independently of what? Independently of conception? And then secondly, can I tell an equally easy story about the truth of moral statements as I can about physical objects?
Right. Well, so a couple of comments. The first one is I want to go back to your example of physical objects.
Yeah.
And make it even more complicated, actually. But then let's not forget to come back to this idea of mind independent in what sense?
Yeah.
So in terms of realism in science, the one that you mentioned, my chair or my desk are objects out there independent of my mind. I think I would call even that I would even call it sort of common sense realism, right?
Yeah.
Now, in terms of philosophy of science, of course, things get more complicated when we're talking about realism and anti-realism of things like unobservable entities, like electrons.
Like quarks.
Yeah, electrons or quarks or things like that, right?
Yeah.
So these are things that scientific theories use to, they deploy as concepts in order to make the theory coherent and also in order to make predictions about empirically verifiable predictions, so sort of, data points. Now, the anti-realist there says, look, I don't know whether these things exist or not out there in the way in which science describes them. What I do know is that they are instrumentally valuable. That is, you can use them. You can assume, you can talk as if they existed, and you can get stuff out of it. You can get empirically testable predictions. The realist, on the other hand, would say, no, these things actually do exist. Electrons and quarks do exist in essentially pretty much the way in which science describes them. So the analogy there with the anti-realist position in ethics might be something along the lines of, look, I don't know what you mean by you realist. What do you mean by these things, facts about the existence of facts, of moral facts, but I can talk about morality as if and get stuff out of this, like I can get social pro-social behavior among human beings. I can get laws that are useful for running society and all that sort of stuff, but I don't need to be committed to this idea that this is actually a reflection of a mind independent reality out there. Does that make sense?
Yes, but then I just want to ask you, in what in what comparable sense can we talk about mind-independent existing duties,
Yeah, right. No,
as opposed to mind-independent existing
right.
objects? That's what I find a bit obscure.
Right. I don't think we actually can. I mean, I suspect at this point, if I were forced to pick between realism and anti-realism, I think I would be an anti-realist at this point.
In ethics.
In ethics, yes.
Okay,
Yeah, I do
go
believe
on.
that quarks actually exist. So I'm
Yeah.
actually a realist in science. And I'm an anti-realist in mathematics. If you just to cover all the bases.
Okay.
Although in that area I started out as really fascinated by mathematical Platonism, and then I sort of moved away from it. Anyway, later on maybe we're gonna get to the point that however, I do think that this may be just a misconceived or no particular useful way of thinking about the issue, that is putting it in terms of realism versus anti-realism. I think there are other ways of thinking about ethics, period. But if we're going to go back to the question of mind independence and all that, I suppose there's one easy answer, which is taken by some realists, although by all means not all, in fact, not even probably the majority of contemporary realist philosophers in ethics. And that is, well, what we mean by realism is that these facts, these things, moral truths are real in the mind of God. Right. I mean that's what a theologically inclined realist philosopher would say.
Yeah, yeah. That's actually where I was thinking. I was thinking, to be a moral realist and to mean it quite in the same way that you mean realism with respect to physical objects or scientific theoretical entities or numbers, etc., would either require some kind of theism, or would require you to have some kind of a Platonic view of moral obligation and duty, which is just sort of hard to imagine.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. It would require something that Mackey, I think, would call a queer kind of metaphysics, right? It's like a weird kind of thing, like what do you mean? How do you cash out these ideas? I mean, in the case of God, I think it's actually surprisingly somewhat clearer, at least, what one might mean. But since I'm a secular person, I rejected the idea that we can invoke gods in order to solve metaphysical issues. Then I'm left with just scratching my head and say, well, what do you mean by physical, real moral truths out there?
Yeah, just should mention for people that don't know, J.L. Mackey, who you mentioned,
yeah,
is probably, would you say, one of the most famous moral anti-realists?
Yeah.
And his book Ethics is considered a kind of a cornerstone of anti-realist thought and ethics. Let me just ask you one more thing while we're on this subject, this question of definitions. Do you think then that, given what we've just said about moral realism, and I think a lot of moral realists may be unhappy to discover that we've described moral realism as really only making any sense in a theistic context, since I think a lot of people would want to deny that.
Yep.
But do you think that maybe that's in part because when people think they're talking about moral realism, they're really talking about something else? They're really talking about moral objectivism?
Well, in some cases, that certainly, I think that's a fair point to be made. I mean, I assume, we want to obviously be charitable to actual professional philosophers working in these areas. So I assume that if somebody has spent their career defending moral realism in academic publications, that person probably does have a somewhat clear understanding of the distinction between realism and objectivism. But I do think that in a lot of conversations, sort of outside of academia, which is really what mostly concerns us here. I mean, we're not trying to settle the issue academically. We're trying to figure out, why this is relevant to sort of the general public. Then I think in the broader area of the broader marketplace of ideas, so to speak, there often is this confusion between objectivism and realism, so that people do assume without further thought that in order to be objective about moral statements, you also have to be a realist, which, as I said, I reject for similar reasons to when I can reject that same claim in mathematics, for instance.
Right.
Now, that said, the problem with sort of some kind of strong ontological conception, a realist conception of moral truths, is that I never heard, at least, this is not my field. I'm a philosopher of science, but I do read quite a bit about ethics and even meta ethics, and I never heard any particularly compelling, or in fact any real assessment or account of what these people mean by realism. I mean, typically, this is treated, the reality, the actual ontological nature of, moral truths is sort of treated as a mystery for all effective purposes. People think, moral realists seem to work under the assumption of, well, I think it is real. I think these things are real, and if they are, then here's what I'm going to get out of it. Here are some consequences. But we don't have an explanation, for instance, an account of if they are real. If moral truths are out there in a sort of a mind-independent way of some sort, then how is it that we can access them? And this, of course, is the same problem that we have with mathematical realism. Right? I mean, one of the objections to mathematical Platonism is, well, you're sort of telling me that there is a sixth sense of some sort that we have, so that we can access these ideal realm of mathematical structures. But how does that work? And I never heard of any any account of how that works. That, of course, is not a problem for common sense realism and even scientific realism, because we know how we access empirical facts about the world. We have the five senses, which are augmented, or however they are, because there is a discussion about cognitive sciences about how many senses we actually have. But whatever, the standard senses, as well as, of course, the augmentation of those senses that comes out of using scientific instruments such as telescopes, microscopes, particle accelerators, and so on and so forth. So we have a pretty good understanding of where we get, how we can access empirical information about, physical objects out there. We do not have anything like that kind of account for either mathematical or ethical realism. And for that matter, also, I mean, we haven't mentioned, but there's yet another type of, I suppose, a class of realism that's about aesthetic statements.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So its beauty is really out there. It's not in the eye of the beholder. It's an objective fact about the world that comes out of some kind, again, of Platonist account of beauty of forms. And in all of those cases, I think that even though there are interesting differences, of course, between mathematics, ethics, and aesthetics, I actually think that they kind of in some sense they form a continuum where the realist interpretation becomes more and more weird. I think I would put, if it were up to me, I would put the mathematical realism at the lower end of the sort of weirdness. I can see why somebody would be a mathematical realist. I reject that position, but I can see it. Then ethical realism seems a little more weird to me, and then aesthetic realism sounds really, really weird. I would have no idea even where to start, unless one were a full-fledged Platonist again, or where to fall back on sort of ideas of deity, both of which I reject as a modern philosopher.
Yeah, I was going to say it's weird in a modern context. In the ancient context, obviously for Plato, the form of the good and the form of the beautiful.
Sure.
I mean, there's this intimate sort of relationship between these concepts, as well as relationship to mathematics.
Right.
And it's partially their aesthetic perfection that is the basis of their realism, right?
That's right.
Of their status, their ontological status. But of course, that sort of commits you to an entire sort of worldview that obviously in the modern era we don't hold.
Right.
We don't accept.
Well, most of us don't.
so let me ask. I mean, just because these are positions that lay people even are going to be familiar with. I mean, given. Well, I'm sure, Massimo, that people will notice that we have once again gone into one of our time machines and changed clothes, and I don't know if I'm any cleaner than I was, but we had some technical difficulties, and we needed to finish recording a week later. So, Massimo, I had asked you. Our topic, as the audience knows, is the question of moral realism.
Right.
And I had asked you, I had said that I thought we needed to do a little disambiguation, because I think a lot of times in this area, certain concepts or terms are conflated. And so I'd asked you to sort of talk a little bit about what you think moral realism is, and then maybe sort of place some of the other positions that are out there on the map.
Right.
So maybe you might want to just, for our sake, not for the audience, recap what you meant, what you said in answer to my question about what moral realism is.
Well, so if we talk about moral realism, I think of moral realism as just one particular type of realism within, sort of philosophical discussion. So it's a metaphysical position, really. It is about the ontology of moral statements or moral truths. And there are other types, as you know, of realism and anti-realism. There's that debate in philosophy of science, for instance, about whether unobservable entities that are postulated by scientific theories, such as electrons and quarks, are real, meaning that we should take them at face value, basically, the way science describes them, or just instrumental. They are sort of hypothetical entities that make the calculations come out right and the experiments being confirmed, but about which one does not need actually to be explicit about endorsing a particular ontological position. There's a similar debate in mathematics about the realism or not of mathematical objects. So there are mathematical Platonists who say that yes, mathematical objects are real in a mind-independent way. They're not only objective but real. And then there are mathematical constructivists who say no, that doesn't make any sense. Talking about a sort of a realm of sort of Platonic mathematical objects is not helpful. We wouldn't know how we actually are able to access that realm. So all we need to say is that mathematical objects are things that we construct, that we invent basically as we go along, but that doesn't mean that they don't have objective properties, because one of the things that we talked about in the first part of this dialogue was about the distinction between objectivity and realism. That is, one can be objective about things that are not ontologically real, right? One can, for instance, invent a new game. Let's say when people invented chess, clearly there's no. I would hope that very few people would argue that there is a ideal realm where chess is mind independent. Chess is a human invention, but once it has been invented and the rules are set down, then there are actually objective facts of the matter about how to play chess. There are objective facts of the matter about certain moves and the consequences of certain moves. So objectivism is different from realism. Now, in the case of morality, of course, the claim here is that the realist claim is that moral truths are not only objective, but they're real in some sense. It's like they're mind independent. There's some kind of consistency, not physical consistency, obviously, but sort of ontological reality. The anti-realist says no. I don't even know. I don't know how to make even sense of that claim, because what would this realm consist of, and again, how would we be able to access it? Now, the only reasonable answer, and I use the word reasonable here with sort of caution. The only reasonable answer, in other words, the only reasonable realist, strong realist position that one can defend is if you're a theist. If you say, well, what I mean by the mind independence of moral truths is, God, moral truths are guaranteed by God's will or by God's mind. But if you don't accept that, if you're a secular person, then you're left with this really weird concept of the reality of moral truths that is really difficult to handle. Now, you were asking me then at the end of the first part was, what about positions in ethics, such as frameworks in ethics, such as utilitarianism or deontology? Are they realist or non-realist? Anti-realist position. That's a very interesting question, and I actually would be, as you know, I'm neither a deontologist nor a consequentialist or utilitarian. I'm actually a virtue ethicist. But and so I'd be interested to see how somebody like Peter Singer, for instance, would answer that question. But the way I think about it, the realism anti-realism debate is on a different level than the debate between different frameworks for ethical reasoning. So I see the realism anti-realism debate as an issue of in meta ethics, as opposed to actual everyday ethics, if you want to put it this way. So for instance, I can imagine, let's take utilitarianism. I could imagine that somebody could be either a realist or an anti-realist about utilitarianism. One can say, well, the reason utilitarians want to maximize happiness and minimize suffering is because that's an objective, mind-independent feature of morality. That's what morality means in a sort of a independent from the human mind fashion. Or the utilitarian could retreat to, or I shouldn't even say retreat, could use or could deploy a anti-realist position and say, look, I understand this is not a universal truth, the cosmos doesn't really care about suffering and happiness, but we're human beings, we do care about suffering and happiness, and so if you take that as an axiom, then you can deploy a logically coherent system which has utilitarians or consequentialists characteristics. And I assume the same can be done for the ontology, and quite frankly, even for virtue ethics, right? Even though virtue ethics, as you know, approaches things from a very different perspective, because in virtue ethics, it doesn't even make sense to ask whether something is right or wrong. That's not the point of the virtue ethicist. The virtue ethicist asks what kind of life one should live. But even within that question, one could be a realist or an anti-realist about it, right? Like one could say, well, there's such a thing as a universal truth about how conscious beings capable of reason should live their lives. Or one could be an anti-realist about virtue ethics and say, look, this is the way we're human beings. We're beings of a certain kind, where this is an accident of evolution, and for us, for beings like us, it makes sense to act in a certain way and to reason in a certain way. But you don't have to invoke any sort of Platonic ideal about virtue in order to do so.
Okay, so let's unpack some of this. With respect to realism, you're characterizing realism as a kind of being a realist about morals is believing that sort of duties and obligations are mind independent, are determined. What is it that we're realist about? Are we realist about duty and obligation?
That's a very good question. I think that at a minimum level, the realist in ethics would have to say that there is a truth of the matter. There is a fact of the matter about whether a moral statement is true or not, right? So if I say, let's talk about actual situations. So if I say that going around randomly killing people is wrong, right? What do I mean by that? Well, for the moral realist will have to say that this statement is subject to truth conditions. It could be true or not true, if you want to use standard, bimodal logic, Aristotelian logic, or it could actually you could use a more complex, multimodal logic and say, well, there's degrees of truth to it, but nonetheless. Let's stick with the basics and say, so the realist is committed to the idea that that particular statement is true, as opposed to say a statement like, according to etiquette, you have to put your fork on the right and your knife on the left. It could be the other way around. I don't know. Right. So nobody presumably would say, or at least very few people would say, that the statement about etiquette is subjected to truth values that are mind independent. They are universal. I mean, that it's clearly a cultural, a completely arbitrary cultural decision. If you live in a particular culture, then you're going to put the fork in here and the knife over there. If you live in a different culture, you're going to do it the right way around. If you even live in a third culture, people won't even know what a fork or a knife is, and they'll use chopsticks. So. Right. So I think that's the contrast that it's often drawn. That is, if you want to be realist about moral statements, then basically what you're saying is that moral statements are subject to truth conditions. And then the question, of course, comes up immediately. Well, where do we get those truth conditions?
Right. I was going to say, it's not just that they have truth conditions. I mean, even as you described, a moral objectivist who's not a realist is going to say that these statements are true, are genuine propositions that are either true or false,
right,
and that have truth conditions. What distinguishes realism is how the truth conditions are cashed out, right?
I suppose so. I mean, you could say, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I suppose you could say that, and this is probably a simplification in I'm sure our friends that publish in meta-ethics will be horrified by this simplification, but I'm going to make it anyway. So following up on what you just said, so maybe one could say that a moral realist is committed to some kind of correspondence theory of truth. Just like not only the scientific realist is, but even the mathematical realist is. Platonists have to invoke some kind of correspondence theory of truth. That is, a mathematical statement is true because it corresponds to this ideal reality in the Platonic realm. Right now, on the other hand, the anti-realist could say, look, I can still use the word truth, but what I mean here, it's a different concept. It's something more along the lines of a coherent theory of truth. It's something like, if I start with certain axioms, either in mathematics or in ethics, then I can derive certain objective, properties of either mathematical or moral statements, and I'm going to use the word true for that, but by truth, that's what I mean. I don't mean that they correspond to something out there. I just mean that they follow logically from whatever axioms I'm going to start with. And of course, somebody can reasonably ask you, well, why are you starting with those axioms rather than others? And then we're going to have a discussion about that.
Okay, so then going back to the question of utilitarianism and Kantianism. So I mean, I agree with you in the sense that they are not their positions that occupy in a sense a different conceptual space than realism and anti-realism, because they're not meta-ethical positions. Right. But I do think that most people, and maybe this is part of the problem, is that people conflate moral realism with moral objectivism.
Yes.
Certainly, they're both morally objectivist. And maybe after I ask you this and we go back a little bit, then back and forth a little bit, we can talk a little bit more about what we mean by moral objectivism. But certainly they're moral objectivists. But I think that most people, and I think I even looked this up on Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and I think they characterize them as morally realist too. Most people think of them as morally realist.
Yes, I think that's fair.
And so let me give you a stab as to how that might go, right? So,
sure.
So with respect to utilitarianism, utilitarianism famously says that we're morally obligated to maximize happiness and to not create unhappiness, where happiness is defined as pleasure in the absence of pain. And that theory of obligation is based upon a prior theory of value that says that pleasure in the absence of pain is the only intrinsic good. Right. Now, Bentham, who is the originator of utilitarianism, argues that value theory is grounded in nature. In other words, right at the opening of his Principles of Morals and Legislation, the very first thing he says is that the reason why you should think that hedonism is true as a value theory is because pleasure, the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain is a basic natural imperative, right? Now, that would make the obligations grounded in something that, I don't know whether even the word mind independence would make sense, but certainly it would ground it in a reality that is neither the result of human decision or agreements, right? So in that sense, would that count as realist in the sense that you mean?
No, and I'm pretty sure that there can be very reasonable room for argument here, for discussion here. But no, it wouldn't count in the way I look at realism, and is the reason. What you just described sounds to me like a naturalistic theory,
it is.
Right?
Yeah, it is.
So it's going to ground eventually. It's going to say that morality at bottom, originates at least. It's not exhausted by, but it certainly originates from whatever human nature is. And human nature, of course, is a result of evolution, and therefore it is an accident in terms of, it's not guaranteed by any general laws of physics. It's just happened to be that way. It could have been different. If that's the case, and by the way, I actually tend to be a naturalist about ethics from that perspective. I actually do think that ethics originates as an instinct that we share with other social primates. It's just that then we go beyond. The reason I don't think, however, as you well know, that ethics is reducible to a science of some sort, or to straightforward biology, is because then we got culture on top of it, and then we got the necessity to sort of elaborate on ethical principles and ethical consequences by reason. So I think that just because ethics is grounded in a naturalistic framework, that doesn't mean that naturalistic framework exhausts ethical reasoning. Just like, by the way, I'm a naturalist about mathematics. I mean, I think that mathematics did originate with our curiosity and ability to count things and look at the shape of things and quantify stuff. But that doesn't mean that mathematical reasoning is then therefore exhausted at that level. So if you're talking about a naturalistic origin or a naturalistic grounding of ethics, I might agree, but I wouldn't call that realism in the same way that we would be discussing before. I mean, maybe we need a different term, and actually, I think naturalism is a good one for that particular approach.
Yeah. Now, with respect to Kant, and I'm only mentioning these two because these are the two moral theories that most people are familiar with, and probably are the ones that dominate the landscape, even in the academic literature.
Yes.
So, with regard to Kantianism, the idea is that a moral obligation is that which a moral obligation is essentially those imperatives that one can rationally will of everyone, and it's probably too complicated and difficult to explain in this sort of medium, but the idea is sort of that basically obligations and duties are things that are distinctively discernible by reason. And because reason, while again not mind independent, it's also not something that is constructed or artificed, right? In the sense that is normally meant by construction and artifice and agreement and stuff like convention and stuff like that. I know that, for example, in the Middle Ages, they believed that natural law could be discerned by reason.
Exactly.
And so, in other words, the plan that God had put into the universe could be discerned by reason. That it's the Catholic notion of fides et ratio, right?
Yes, exactly.
And so, would Kant then not count as a realist? Because in a sense, what reason does is detect these timeless, mind-independent truths that if one is in a theistic framework actually can detect the sort of the structure of reality and of the universe. Would Kant then count as a moral
if you put it that way, and Kant specifically, yes, it definitely would. And in fact, as you know, so Kant is the most prevalent contemporary modern example of deontology. But of course, deontological systems are very common among religions. The Ten Commandments, of course, is a deontological system. So in that sense, many, if not all, of deontological systems are realists, because many of them actually invoke the existence of a God in order to justify the ontological status of the commandments. The commandments are ontologically real because God is ontologically real.
Right.
Now, in the case of Kant, I think you're right that the way you sort of reconstructed the reasoning is exactly right, and therefore that would make Kant a realist. All I was saying is that one does not need to be committed to the idea that there is a moral law within, as Kant famously put it, that we discover by reason. One can simply say, look, I think it's a promising starting point if I build an ethical system based on the categorical imperative, right? Or one or the other of the two versions of the categorical imperative. So either you should only do things that you will could be universal, or you do things you treat other people always as a not only as a means to an end but also as an end in themselves. Okay, I could say, well, either those two are the result of sort of rational introspection, and you discover these mysterious moral law within yourself. Or you can say, look, as it turns out, if you start with that axiom, with the categorical imperative, you can derive rationally a coherent system that actually seems to work very well for regulating human affairs. In which case, you've come up with an anti-realist version of Kantianism. I'm not saying that's what Kant was doing. Yeah, I think you're right that Kant definitely thought of this thing in realist terms, even though, of course, at the time the word wasn't around. To label this position. But what I'm saying is that what I was saying a few minutes ago is that although you're right that both consequentialism or utilitarianism and deontology are usually understood as realist positions, nothing really gets in the way of reconsidering them or sort of recasting them as anti-realist positions, precisely because there is a leeway, there is a little bit of a detachment, logical detachment between sort of meta-ethics and
Right.
ethical reasoning, everyday ethical reasoning.
Right. So in other words, one could be a moral I don't even want to. Let's not say a moral anti-realist. Let's say not a moral realist.
Okay.
Well, because I think there's some ambiguities there too.
Yeah.
I think sometimes moral anti-realism just means not realism,
Right.
but sometimes it means people who think there are no obligations or duties in any sense, right?
Correct.
So I'm just going to say not a metaphysical realist. So the point is just that someone could be not a metaphysical realist and still either think that consequences are morally relevant, which is what will make them a consequentialist,
right,
or think that motives and principles are morally relevant, which will make them a deontologist,
right,
even though in the larger picture they don't think that duties and obligations are anything that exists separate either separately from human agreement or, in other words, the focus on consequence or intent or principle can proceed regardless of what one's meta-ethical position is.
That's right.
Is in a sense what you're saying, and I think that maybe one of the things we'll be doing is sort of clearing up some confusions. I think that a lot of people don't realize that they think that somehow the meta-ethical discussion has some very strong. I mean, I'm thinking of some arguments I've had on your blog,
right,
not your blog, on your webzine,
yeah,
Scientia,
mm-hmm,
with certain parties who shall go unnamed, about who keep hammering on moral realism.
right.
And I think that sometimes they make a mistake in thinking that penetrates more deeply into the first order
right,
discourse than it really does. And,
right.
and I think you've just given a nice way of showing that it really does need.
So let me bring up another way of thinking about this, which I kind of hinted at before. But as you notice, I often draw a parallel between ethics and mathematics, not because they're the same kind of things, but because I think they're similar enough that parallels are actually more enlightening than not. Now, you mentioned Scientia Salon. So recently on the magazine, we have had a discussion based on a two-part essay that I wrote about Lee Smolin and Roberto Unger book that came out recently called The Single Universe and the Reality of Time. The book, we don't need to get into the details because the book is about cosmology and the status of physics. But there is a really interesting couple of chapters there, one in each part of the book, about mathematics, the nature of mathematics. And Lee Smolin in particular, who is the physicist of the pair, the other one is a philosopher, Unger is a philosopher, has come up with what I never actually encountered before. I mean, I don't know if the position is entirely original with him, but it probably isn't. But I never encountered before, and when I read it, I said, oh, okay, that makes sense. So he has the same problem, right? He wants to retain the idea that mathematics is a special and kind of intellectual endeavor which is very powerful and very useful for science, but he wants to get away from what he sees, I think correctly, as sort of the mysticism, or at least the ontologically troublesome idea of mathematical Platonism. Okay, and so how does he do that? He introduces this idea of evoking or evocation. So he says, look. People typically get stuck into a dichotomy, which turned out to be false. It's either mathematical objects are real in a Platonic sense, and therefore mathematics is an objective pursuit of knowledge, or mathematics is an invention, it's a human invention, and people just make up stuff as they go, and therefore there is no truth to the matter really about mathematical propositions. It's just some of them are useful, some of them are not. And he says, look, neither one of this actually gets us very far. There is a third option. The third option is that mathematics is a human invention, just like the game of chess, let's say, that I mentioned earlier. But that once you do invent it, and it has a naturalistic origin, by the way, which he goes into, right? There are several stages of a naturalistic origin of mathematics and mathematical thinking, which of course started out initially as very much grounded in sort of practical problems of counting and simple geometry and things like that. But once it gets going, then mathematicians sort of develop new approaches to things. They introduce axioms and then derive logical consequences from these axioms. And the idea is that once you start introducing new notions and once you start introducing, let's say, new axioms, then you are evoking certain truths. That is, once you assume, let's say, the parallel postulate, for instance, in geometry, then certain things become objectively true. Right. The Pythagorean theorem or a number of other theorems in mathematics become objectively true. There's no discussion about it. Just like certain characteristics of the game of chess become objectively true, and people in fact can do a lot of research and a lot of interesting investigations about the properties of the game of chess. So he calls these evoked properties, meaning that these properties were not out there to be discovered in a mind-independent way. They were just they didn't exist until somebody said, hey, let's start with these axioms, or let's formulate this particular axiom. Once the axiom is formulated, however, these properties, objective properties, are evoked into existence using Smolin's sort of vocabulary, and they become objective. They definitely are objective. There's no disagreement, rational disagreement about what they are. So now, of course, ethics is much less formalized than mathematics, and that's why we can have a hell of a lot more reasonable discussion about ethical principles and what they imply and so on and so forth. But I don't think they are arbitrary either. I don't think you can get everything you want out of ethical principles. Once you start with certain principles, which are the ethical equivalent of axioms in mathematics, then certain things do follow rationally and other things do not follow rationally. Now, again, just like in mathematics, you can say, well, but why are you picking those axioms or those assumptions rather than others? And we can have an interesting discussion about that. Some of those axioms, I think, are spring sort of pretty naturally from the naturalistic roots of both mathematics and ethics. Others are, made up, invented by ethicists or mathematicians because they seem promising, and then people explore the consequences of them. I think that actually, something like a Kantian deontological system is a good example of it. What you can say, okay, so if we do start with the idea that we should always treat people as ends in themselves and not just as means to an end, what follows from that? So ethics at that point becomes not a matter of here's a truth and now I'm going to discover it. It becomes a matter of a series of if-then statements. So if I start with this assumption, then what follows from it? Yeah. And of course, people are that disagree with a particular ethical conclusion can do two things, just like they can always do in logic, right? They can either question the soundness of the validity of your reasoning. I can say, well, actually, it doesn't. As it turns out, what you think follows from your axioms doesn't, and here's why. Or they can question the axiom and say, well, why did you pick that one? Or I think that this other axiom is better, more defensible, or more appropriate for beings, social beings capable of reason, such as humans, and so on and so forth. Which is why, by the way, I do think that discussions about the different ethical frameworks will never be settled, and they cannot be.
Mark. So, Massimo, is your thing working?
Yeah, it is. I hope.
I will have the audience know that this is Massimo's fault. Massimo is on some Wi-Fi in the bottom of the Port Authority bus terminal, and the homeless people keep running off with his.
That's right.
Equipment.
I'm actually surprisingly in my office at the Graduate Center at CUNY, and boy, that's no different.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
It's no different apparently from the Port Authority bus terminal. Anyway.
Okay, Massimo, you were talking about why this comparison of mathematics and ethics, and why you think this shows that we're never going to come to a single ethical theory or resolve the dispute between utilitarians and Kantians and such. So why don't you just pick up from there?
So if you think of ethics, again, as similar, though non-identical, because to mathematics, because mathematics is much more formal and much more structured and all that. But if you think of it in that way, then you have to admit that logic by itself sort of has to underdetermine the choice of ethical frameworks. So that you can say, look, utilitarianism may or may not work, may or may not be a good idea. We can have a discussion about this, or we can have a similar discussion about deontology, or a similar discussion about virtue ethics, or any of the other, ethical frameworks that are being proposed. For instance, ethics of care. But if you ask the question, well, which one is true? I mean, that question makes no sense. For the same reason that it doesn't make much sense to ask whether, let's say, Euclidean geometry or spherical geometry are true. I'm not sure what that means.
Right.
It's like, well, one can be more useful for certain applications than others, or you can ask whether they've been developed in a coherent way, and and so on. But to say, well, which one is true, again, invokes some kind of, at least implicitly, some kind of correspondence theory of truth, and therefore it brings you back to sort of this weird ontological realism. If you reject that, then you're left with a coherence theory of truth. But as you know, coherence definitely usually grossly underdetermines sort of the empirical world, and it underdetermines what happens in the real world. So you can say, well, I decide for whatever reason that I want to be a deontologist. I think that Kant's imperative, categorical imperative is a good idea, so I'm going to try to develop a system that is coherent with that. And nobody can say, well, you're wrong. They can say you're not coherent, or you're not deriving it in well enough.
Yeah.
But you can't say they're wrong.
Well, although you can sort of point out that there are any number of cases in which the Kantian theory would seem to give you the wrong answer, right? I mean, at least one that sort of violates our pre-theoretic moral intuitions.
In which case you can say that what's happening there is that it doesn't work well, right?
Yeah,
so it's similar to, again, let me draw the analogy here with, so let's say, a mathematical model. Right. One of the things is, when I was a more active scientist before I turned full-time to philosophy, I was doing a little bit of, I was mostly an empirical scientist, but I was doing a little bit of modeling, of certain situations in ecology and evolutionary biology. And the first thing you realize about models is that they cannot possibly be wrong unless you wrote the code wrong. Right,
right.
Which is the equivalent in computer science of deriving irrational or illogical or incoherent consequences from your axioms. But if you wrote the code correctly, then the model cannot be wrong. What can be going wrong is that the model doesn't correspond well enough to reality. In other words, it doesn't work. It's not useful. But you can't say, well, the model is wrong, unless there is an actual mistake built into it. So
right. Although in the case of ethics, if you're going to say that the model doesn't correspond well to reality, then that would seem to imply that there's a moral reality for it to correspond to,
right?
Which then sounds like moral realism again.
But if you're putting that in terms of, that's a very good point. So let me be very clear about it, or as clear as I can get about it, which is what I meant when, if you say, well, certain consequences from a Kantian system don't work. I don't mean that they don't work when they're compared to a sort of an ideal reality. I mean that they don't seem to, as you put it a minute ago, they seem to contradict what you call pre-theoretical ethical commitments, right? So in other words, they go against a naturalistic understanding of morality. And if that's the case, then of course we have to come up with, then we're faced with a choice. We either say, well, too bad for our naturalistic commitment, or too bad for our intuitions. And sometimes that actually is not a bad idea, right? Yeah. And in other cases, you could say, well, actually, no, this commits me to things that are really are unacceptable, and therefore too bad for the system that committed me to these solutions. Now, I can already hear the critics say, oh, but then that means, anything goes, and it's all arbitrary and all that. No, I don't think that anything goes. I think that if you do reject either your pre-theoretical commitments or your theoretical ones, then you still have to come up with reasons for it. I mean, it's like, so why do you think that particular theoretical, pre-theoretical commitment is so strong that it ought to be maintained, even though it seems to be incoherent with the rest of a system that you think works? And vice versa. If you say, well, I'm going to abandon the system that was working until now, but now I found the problem, you say, well, is the problem really that cogent to say that you want to abandon the system, or can you perhaps work on the system? And after all, modern Kantianism is not identical to the original version that we find in Kant's works, and modern utilitarianism is certainly not identical to the original works of Bentham or even Mill. Right? So that's what philosophers do. They find situations that are problematic, and they work around. They try to work around the system and sort of improve it. Chisel things a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even someone like, if you look at John Rawls's social contractarianism, not as a political theory, but as an ethic, which many people do. You can even say that there are people who are trying to create new frameworks that try to incorporate elements of these other frameworks that are somewhat mutually exclusive, yet satisfying in themselves, and yet never completely satisfying. And so, yeah, I entirely look. In this sense, I think you and I probably get to the same place, maybe through slightly different routes. My general, I don't think any ontological questions go beyond frames of reference or conceptual frameworks. In that sense, I'm a metaphysical anti-realist, and sort of a la Nelson Goodman. And so, to me, there's no harm in saying that there are really duties, because I understand all ontological commitments as occurring within frameworks, and I don't think ontological questions can be asked outside of frameworks. And so, to me, to say that there's a duty is simply to say, given a certain set of assumptions and in a certain frame of reference, I'm going to ontologically commit to duties. But that's not saying anything metaphysically realist in the sense that is meant when people talk about realist ontologies. And so we wind up, I think you and I wind up probably in the same place. Let me ask you, so just to quickly, to distinguish now moral objectivism, because then I want to ask you something about normativity.
Okay.
So, how would you define moral objectivism in contrast with moral realism?
So here I would use the same concept that I brought up earlier from Lee Smalling, the concept of evocation, right? So I think that moral objectivism means that there are certain statements, certain moral statements that follow logically and coherently from certain axioms that one might use in building an ethical system. And that's all I mean by objectivism. So it's not, so moral truths are objective, not in the sense that they correspond to something, metaphysical out there, but in the sense that they are logically and coherently derived from a particular set of axioms. Now, some people might not be satisfied with that and say, well, but that opens up the possibility of moral relativism, complete relativism. I don't think it does. Just like there is no relativism in mathematics, for instance. Even if you do start with different axioms, certain things then become objectively true. And there's even no relativism about the game of chess. It's not like you can say whatever you want about the game of chess, because there are certain rules and certain consequences are mandated by those rules.
Right.
So now the relativist could retreat one more level, right? It could say, well, okay, I'm going to make a meta-ethical statement, sort of relativistic meta-ethical statement, and say there's no reason, there's no way to discriminate between different set of axioms. So there's no way to ground your ethics into anything objective at that level, so at the meta-ethical level. And there I would have to say, well, there are still some things that are non-arbitrary there. If you do agree on some kind of naturalistic account of ethics or the origin of ethics, then even at that level you cannot be entirely relativistic, because human beings have certain characteristics. We have certain desires. We have certain I do actually think that there is such a thing as human nature, as broadly defined and as fluid as it may be. Now, interestingly, I have a colleague right here at the Graduate Center, Jesse Prince, who is definitely a moral relativist, and he's on record for that, and we had a number of discussions about it. And when I brought up this point, I found out that he's in fact, coherently, I think, he's in fact skeptical about the very notion of human nature. He just rejects entirely the idea of a human nature. He thinks that biology has nothing whatsoever to do with the way we organize societies and relations and so on and so forth. And there I have to part ways, both as a biologist. I'm not a genetic determinist. I'm not a biological determinist, but I don't think the biology has nothing to do with the way we work as living organisms, and also, quite frankly, as a virtue ethicist. Aristotle will certainly be baffled by the idea that there's no such thing as human nature. Now, is human nature, however, pliable? and can it be, altered, for instance, through sort of cultural evolution? I think that's true. I found this really interesting essay a few years ago about David Hume's conception of human nature. So he did have a conception of human nature, which was a naturalistic one, but he also thought that human nature is changeable. And the way you do change it is in fact through cultural, what we today would call cultural evolution, and it would call cultural
Right.
adjustments or cultural modifications, right? So that because we build, on culture is built on, of course, on a foundations of biology, and the more culture becomes complex, the more culture becomes independent of, or less directly connected to biology, which is why I'm not a determinist and not a reductionist. But even that doesn't happen arbitrarily. I mean, there are certain things that human beings that are simply unnatural for human beings, and you don't get them to do. I mean, I think that, for instance, this is going to be a little bit of a simplification of a very complex issue. But I think that the reason why we never had and never will have either a Marxist utopia or a libertarian utopia is because those two doctrines, political philosophical doctrines, make unreasonable assumptions about human nature. A Marxist
Right.
ideology essentially treats human beings as social insects, as individuality doesn't matter. We are all in sort of this kind of B type or Ant type society, which is clearly not the case. The libertarian political philosophy makes exactly the opposite assumption, which is that we are essentially completely independent individuals that don't need really society, or that have very little use, comparatively speaking, for social interactions and social interdependence. That's also not going to work.
Right.
And those are both not going to work. And they're dead in the water, precisely because human nature is a complex mix of those two. We are individualistic to some extent, but we're also inherently and inextricably social to some extent.
Yeah.
And that's why
Yeah.
things like, as you know, there's been lots of discussions about whether fundamental social units such as the family, Aristotle famously thought of the family as a fundamental social unit. And he thought of it, he had a very interesting image of it. Aristotle thought of families as well as cities, polis, as social groups that are the purpose of which is to engender good living, right? So the idea is that when they function well, when they have their function, when they perform their function well, they allow people to have a good life, or the best life that is possible to have, given material constraints. Now, there's been a lot of discussion, of course, throughout the 20th century about whether this idea of a family structure or group structure of a particular type is not, in fact, simply a arbitrary one that can be done without. And people have explored different models of organizing groups, and by and large, they've all failed. With some exceptions, with partial exceptions. I mean, obviously, we're modifying the very structure of a family. Look at, of course, gay rights, the affirmation of gay rights in contemporary society. So we are changing some of the structure of the family, but we haven't gotten rid of it. Whenever we tried, to organize communes and much more sort of basic egalitarian societies, pretty much they've all failed. And I think that there is a reason for why they failed, because they just don't work very well with this complex mixture of biology and culture that has shaped human nature over the last several millennia. Now, if we went back to not only pre-industrial but also pre-agricultural society, one can make an argument that some of these more egalitarian models would work. But one of the reasons, and they probably did work in early human evolution, but the reason they worked is because the structure was very different in terms of, for instance, group size. Good luck implementing a completely egalitarian system of, let's say, representation, direct representation in a society that is made of hundreds of millions of individuals. It's just not going to work. It does work when you have 50 individuals in the group. It does not. It simply ceases to work structurally when you go to millions. Now you say, but I don't have to go to millions. Fine, you don't have to. But if you want to live in New York City, certain approaches to structure just are not going to work. Political structure are not going to work. And apparently also occasionally Wi-Fi isn't going to work.
Yeah. So the reasons why these artificial sort of planned communities don't work is maybe in a sense the same reason. This is my inclination partly, is the same reason why moral theories don't work, and that is that they focus on only one element. When human beings are characterized by a complexity of elements, and I also think human beings are characterized by a complexity of elements which are oftentimes mutually contradictory. And so you have the further problem is that the pre-theoretic template that you're trying to then systematize into a theory is itself not internally consistent. And so the attempt on the parts of theories which have to be internally consistent that they're never going to adequately replicate or model something that is inherently inconsistent in the way it operates.
Well, that's before you go ahead, I think this is an excellent point that really bear sort of reiteration. It's like, because this is a source of a lot of confusion among people. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Our pre-theoretical commitment, as we call them, which from a naturalistic perspective just come out eventually out of the kind of social being that humans are, and of course also from the result of cultural evolution and so on and so forth. But so those pre-theoretical commitments, you're right, they're definitely not coherent. You wouldn't expect them to be logically coherent because they're the result of historical, both biological and cultural evolution. So there was no plan there, overall plan. And when you're trying to match them with a system that you're trying to be ethical system you're trying to make as logically rigorous as possible, it's not going to work. That is precisely why, or at least that's one of the reasons why I'm a virtue ethicist and not a deontologist or utilitarian, because virtue ethics is not that kind of rigid, logically coherent system. It's one of, it is often accused, virtue ethicists are often accused of being, vague enough that a bunch of different courses of action can fit under the virtue ethical banner. I don't see that as a criticism. I see that as an advantage. I see that as
right. That actually describes the situation as it is, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and Aristotle famously did not think you could have any more precision. He has a whole methodological introduction in the Nicomachean Ethics talking about just what level of rigor one can accomplish in a science like the moral sciences, and he says it's relatively limited because so much of it is determined by features of local contexts. And actually, this provides me with an opportunity just to sort of push a little bit on the idea of objectivity. See, I don't see objectivism as necessarily inconsistent. Moral objectivism as necessarily inconsistent with a certain kind of relativism, right? Because in my view, Aristotle's conception of a virtue is both objective and relative in the following sense. So, in a certain set of circumstances, my rushing at a group of people with a gun would be courageous, right? So if the circumstances that we're in a just war and there's some decent chance of success, and we're fighting for the right reason and all of that, you stipulate all of those aspects of the context, and then my running at these people with the gun is courageous. If you change the context, it could be not only not courageous, but it could be the opposite. It could be rash or crazy or insane. If the context isn't a war, but instead I'm 13 years old and it's my junior high school cafeteria, then it's not a courageous act, right? And so in that sense, virtues are relative, right? At least they're relative to the features of the context, but that doesn't make them unobjective. Once the features of the context are set, something certainly counts as courageous and something else counts as cowardly and something else counts as rash.
And again, this kind of flexibility, which I think is an advantage of virtue ethics, is much more difficult to get out of a more formal system like, let's say, Kantian deontology. I mean, that's why Kant famously gets in trouble immediately, as soon as it's off the gun.
Yeah, you can't with Kant, because Kant thinks the context has to be irrelevant, because he wants these moral statements to be universal.
That's right. That's how Kant famously said that lying is always wrong thing to do. Well, there's a cottage industry of counterexamples that now even introductory philosophy students, undergraduate students can mention about. Well, but what about the Nazi that knocks at your door and asks you if you're hiding the Jew in the basement? Would you lie in that setting?
That's right.
Yeah, of course I would.
Right, right. So, but to be fair to Kant, Kant himself, however, is responding to a different set of intuitions. And that is, for example, that the idea that one of the things that distinguishes moral obligations from other kinds of obligations we operate under is that moral obligations have a much wider scope, have a maximal scope. They apply to all rational beings as opposed to just members of a certain
Right.
club or members of a certain tribe or whatever. And so, in other words, I think that the larger point is that, that you were saying before is that each of these has a piece of the truth because each of these theories is focusing on one aspect of our pre-theoretical sense of moral intuitions, but when you put them all together, they're incoherent. And so I agree with you that of all these theories, Aristotle's is the best because it doesn't even try to give a single account that focuses on one feature or a small handful of features. So let me ask you now, with an eye on time. Let me ask you now. It seems to me that the reason why people want to be moral realists is because they're worried about normativity, right? And so it seems to me that the idea is something like this. So when we talk about a statement being normative, we mean that it implies an ought, right? And therefore, because it applies an ought, it has a certain force, right? It has a certain force on the person to whom it's directed. And I think that the reason why people insist on being moral realists, and I've heard this from the theistic side. I mean, this is one of William Lane Craig's favorite arguments, is that without God and thus a morally realist framework behind it, there aren't any objective moral truths. I think this is why it's important to disambiguate moral realism from moral objectivism, because I suspect what you're going to say is that we can get this normativity out of objectivism. You don't need the moral realism to get the normativity. Is that what you're going to say, that moral objectivism is sufficient?
Absolutely,
for
you read my mind. Yes, so again, going back to our analogy with chess, right? We get objectivity out of the rules of chess. And if we agree on the rules, there are certain statements that objectively and absolutely follow, and there's really very little room for discussion. Now, that said, it sounds to me like Craig hasn't read, or hasn't, well, I'm sure he's read it, but he hasn't thought about Euthyphro's dilemma, because that idea that gods are guarantors of moral realism, it's actually, in my mind, has been dead in the waters for 2,400 years because of Plato. But, that's a different discussion. We're not going to have today. But I think the general point that you make is, in fact, correct. Once you decouple realism from objectivism, then you can see how you can retain the latter, you can retain objectivism without actually having to commit yourself to a particular metaphysical position. That's one of the advantages of anti-realism in general, right? That is that it reduces the metaphysical baggage. Because the metaphysical baggage does come at a price, because somebody then is going to obviously ask you the question, well, how do you account for A, that ontological statement that you're making, and B, how do you account for how we can access those kind of truths?
And how do you distinguish the correct ones from the incorrect ones? And if we have rival God frameworks, how do you determine which one is the right one? And that sort of thing. But let me just push you a little bit, because it seems to me that I'm a little more sympathetic to at least someone like Craig's motivation. And so here's where I would push you a little bit. So yes, I agree with you 100%. Once we accept the framework of chess, there are things you ought to do and things you ought not to do. I want to keep the language of obligation here, right? And those are objective, right? But of course, I can simply say I don't want to play chess, right? In other words, I can, in a sense, eschew the entire framework and refuse to play. And I think that what someone like Craig is worried about is that, look, yes, maybe you can say within a certain framework, these things are moral obligations. But what then do we say to the person who simply refuses to play, right? If we're going to treat morals as a language game, let's go
Wittgenstein,
right?
Sure.
That's right. Since I have to mention them at least once every conversation. If we're going to treat morality as a language game, why can't somebody simply say, what do we say to the person if somebody says, I refuse to play? And so in that circumstance, the obligations don't apply to me. Because I'm not playing. I'm not within the framework.
So there's two answers to that, I think. One is the flippant one, so I'm going to give you that one first. Okay, you refuse to play. I'm going to declare you a psychopath, and I'm going to lock you away. In other words, society is about certain rules that we agree on or that we constantly negotiate, right? I mean, you can make the same argument for law, for instance, right? You could say, well, I didn't sign up on all these laws that people are putting on the books, and therefore I consider myself outside, and I'm not going to follow them. And some people actually in the United States, for instance, do make their reasoning, deploy their, let's call it reasoning, as far as, for instance, paying or not paying taxes concerned, right? Their interpretation of the law is that the Constitution, that taxing people is unconstitutional. So regardless of what the Supreme Court says, they're not going to pay taxes. What does the federal government do? They go after them. Right, they go after them. Yeah. So that's the flippant, answer, which actually I think has some truth, some level of truth in there.
It's true, but notice it's not a moral answer. In other words, the reason why I ought to play the moral game is not itself a moral reason, right? In other words, if the moral obligation is defined within the frame of the game, then you can't say I'm morally obligated to play the game. And so ultimately then, it sounds to me then like normativity, moral normativity is ultimately grounded in violence, right? Or in a kind of social violence, right?
Right. Well, yeah, if you want to put it that way, yes. That's in answer to my first question. Now that's
the flippant answer. Right? Okay, so what's the non-flippant answer?
The non-flippant answer, I mean, you might not like it anymore, actually, or Craig might not like it anymore, but nonetheless, here's the best I can do. So, I want to switch now back from the analogy between ethics and sort of chess, which has that, all analogies have limitations. Let's keep that in mind, right?
Yeah.
That it's got exactly the limitations you're talking about. To an analogy, a better analogy, I think, between, let's say, ethics and geometry, right?
Okay.
Again, keeping in mind, of course, that it is only an analogy, and therefore it has its own limitations. So, in the case of geometry, let's say that we say, well, we're gonna use Euclidean geometry to navigate local space here on Earth, and we're going to switch to spherical geometry if we're going to navigate throughout the solar system. Now you can say, well, those are arbitrary. There's an infinite number of geometries out there, and I refuse to play those two particular games. I'm going to come up and with a hyper geometrical theory, whatever, and I'm going to play that game. I can say, well, yeah, but if you're playing that game, that other game that you just invented, it's just not going to work very well, because on Earth, as it turns out, even though there is an infinite number of geometrical systems you could actually use for most practical purposes, Euclidean geometry works very well. And therefore, on pragmatic grounds, you really are better off using that one. But if you switch to interplanetary travel, then Euclidean geometry, for equally objective reasons, does not work very well, and so you need to switch to spherical geometry. So what that means is that essentially you're coming up with a naturalistic constraint. I don't want to say grounding necessarily, because that sounds like a little too one-to-one relationship. But I do think that there are naturalistic constraints. I mean, as we were talking earlier about human nature as a naturalistic constraint, right? There are naturalistic constraints that simply make it so that certain approaches to ethics are better than others. Now, do those naturalistic constraints narrow down things so that you can say, well, there's only one ethical system that's going to work? No, I don't think so.
But do they operate in such a way that they can, in some way, inform the idea that one must play the ethics language game? See, in the case of geometry, you have appeal to a sort of at least a relatively clear notion of a reality that constrains what are the practical choices amongst the frameworks, right? But if you don't want to appeal to some sort of moral reality, but you want to appeal to human nature, can you, in a sense, use human nature the same way to say, look, you really can't opt out of the ethics game. It's not because you have an ethical obligation to play the ethics game, because of course that begs the question. But is that where sort of the idea of the evolutionary roots of ethics are going to provide a naturalistic constraint that, in a sense, we can't, to a certain extent, avoid the ethics game?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. Now, this sound in the background, which People may or may not hear. It's distracting.
I don't hear
Excellent.
it.
So great. So ignore it. It just passed. So here's another way then to put the issue. I do think that the constraints are real. As I said, I do think that there is such a thing as a non-arbitrary human nature. But let's go even way further and say talk about the laws of physics. One could say, look, if there is anything that is constraining on people's behaviors are the laws of physics, you really ought to respect, let's say, gravity, right?
Right.
But of course, that's not true. Meaning that you could jump out of the window of the 15th floor of a building thinking that you're going to fly. You could try to violate the laws of physics, right? Of course, you're going to be end up splashed on the ground, and the consequences are not going to be particularly good. But even the laws of physics are not binding in that way. That meaning there's no ought there either, right? It's like, I don't believe in gravity, I'm going to jump. What you're going to face are simply consequences, pretty dire consequences, I would say. But you're going to face those consequences. Your behavior is still really not constrained even by the laws of physics. And if your behavior is not constrained by the laws of physics, I don't see why anybody would want to claim that logic has to constrain somebody's behavior, or coherence has to constrain behavior. It doesn't have. So the normative force, I don't think is to be understood as you have no choice but to do this. It has to be construed. It can only be construed as a conditional. If you want to live in a reasonably flourishing society where basic tenets of human nature and culture are respected and so on and so forth, then you have to do this kind of thing. If you don't, then you're going to build another society, and good luck with that.
It sounds to me then that you are saying to a certain extent that the evolved social reality of human nature does create a kind of constraint like the laws of gravity and physics, that in a sense they don't really compel you to play the ethics game or the physics game, the gravity game, but they do in a sense make the consequences of not playing it intolerable, right? I mean, they make the and I actually think this is really important, because I think one of the things that people don't think about enough in ethics, people use the word normative all the time, and people say that ethical obligations have normal force, they're more normative force, that they're overriding of other considerations. But I've never ever heard anybody really explain very clearly where the normative force comes from. What does it actually consist of? Somebody says to you, you ought to do X. And even if they can give you a Kantian proof for why you ought to do X, where does the actual force come from? Why can't a person simply say, I don't care about being ethical. I refuse. And I think that part of the mistake that people like Craig make is that I think they think that somehow the force is self-contained within the obligation. And if you simply show that the obligation is based in a reality, that the force, the efficacy of the normative of the moral claim is just sort of automatic, and I think in that sense they're looking for something that there is never going to be. The normative force ultimately always is some sort of practical sanction.
Correct, and in fact,
it always lies.
That's right, and in fact, even Craig, who thinks that he can find it in God, that's why I mentioned Euthyphro's dilemma before, right? I mean, that he's going to impale himself on one of the two horns of the dilemma, because if we're going to say that the normativity comes out of the will of God, you're still saying, for all effective purposes, that it comes out of violence or the threat of violence. You're saying, well, I'm doing this thing because otherwise I'm going to go to hell. All right. If that's not violence, I don't know what is. In fact, in some sense, that's the ultimate violent threat, right? Eternal punishment. So even Craig does not get out of it, and he cannot get out of it. There's just no logical way to get out of it. So to me, I always interpret, ought statements in terms of conditionals. If it's hypothetical imperatives, as Kant called them. Exactly. If you want to live in this kind of society, if you want to flourish as a human being, etc., then this seems like a reasonable course of action. If you don't care, go ahead. Go on a deserted island and do whatever the hell you want. But we don't want you in this society.
Right, right. And so the sort of the ground level moral statements um, may have, at least superficially, the form of a categorical
Right.
imperative, right? We don't say you ought not murder somebody unless you don't care about going to
Right.
jail. But ultimately, the force that the obligation has, the force that the moral obligation statement carries, is ultimately due to a hypothetical imperative that if you want to sort of, as you said, participate in be a social animal and live with other people and be, then you'd better play the ethical language game, which includes doing things like obeying these superficially categorical statements like don't
Exactly.
murder and don't and
Exactly.
right,
You
right,
want to
right.
be a member of
um
a particular club, then you better play by the rules of the club.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I guess the idea is that, well, normativity is ultimately what motivates the desire for moral
Yes.
realism. But we realize now that A, moral realism doesn't give
Right.
it to you, and B, what you can get, you can get simply out of moral objectivism.
Yes.
Um, but that at the end of the day, we both, I think, agree that ultimately the sanction that these moral statements carry is that ultimately at some level to disobey them carries some practical sanction to it. There's nothing inherently forceful about these sorts of statements, as I think people like Craig and maybe
Yes.
other robust moral realists think
That's
that
right.
there are.
That's right.
Right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we did a good job with this, despite the fact that we had a lot of interruptions, and I'm hoping the Blogging Heads people can splice it together in a way
Makes
that the
sense. That's
audience will
right.
follow.
It makes sense.
But I greatly appreciate once again some excellent
It was a
conversation,
pleasure.
Massimo. All right. Thank
Thank
you very
you.
much. See you soon. All right. Stopping now.